for Montana State University of the Institute on Ecosystems, and I'm glad to see everyone here and some new faces. The Rough Cut Seminar is our weekly seminar that shares science and research and practice on a variety of environmental science and environmental studies topics. So it's great to see those of you who are new. And I want to remind you, just from a housekeeping standpoint, that this seminar is being recorded for future viewing. What generally works pretty well is our speaker will speak uninterrupted, and then we'll have questions that we can facilitate after the talk, and we can do that either through raising hands, using the WebEx feature, through chat, or through unmuting, and that usually works pretty smoothly. So this fall, all of our Rough Cut speakers have been asked to share with us their knowledge about research and practice related to the climate emergency. Next week, I want to make sure that you mark your calendars for Dr. Rich Reddy from the Ag Econ department here at MSU. We'll be speaking on federal climate policy, what works and what doesn't. And also, as a reminder, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Institute on Ecosystems has been affiliated with a number of important reports on climate change in Montana, climate change in human health, and climate change in the greater Yellowstone ecosystems. If you go to our website or you go to montanaclimate.org, you'll find links to those reports. So I've long hoped to bring today's speaker here to Bozeman as a visiting lecturer, and one day we'll do that, but her work is too important to not do as soon as possible, so I'm really glad she could be here virtually. Hannah Gosnell is a professor of geography in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. As you know from her bio, she has broad expertise in rural sustainability topics and an interest in human dimensions of global change, environmental governance and collaboration, water issues, and today's topic, rangelands, the people who own them and the people who manage them. She's worked extensively in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and in Montana. She's no stranger to our landscapes. And I'm very fortunate to call Dr. Gosnell a mentor, a collaborator, and a friend, and I'm so pleased she could join us today. So Hannah, I'll have you take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. What an honor to be introduced by you and to be welcomed here. I know this normally is a series for Montana speakers, so I feel like a bit of an invader being from Oregon, but what I have to talk about is certainly relevant to your landscape there. Thanks for inviting me to share some of my research on regenerative agriculture. I'm actually heading to Bozeman on Friday. I'm really excited about my upcoming trip there, both to see my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Julia, and also for a 2-day workshop on rangeland carbon tracking and management. So this talk will be a really good warm-up for me to get my head back into that subject matter. From what I understand, the purpose of this gathering that's coming up next week, like so many others I've seen lately, virtually and real time, is to share information about the role rangelands can play in soil carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation, and to consider ways that rangelands and ranchers can be included in voluntary carbon markets to incentivize better range management. And as many of you have probably noticed, climate smart regenerative ag has been gaining a lot of attention lately, not only for its potential to mitigate climate change, but also for its potential to enhance the overall resilience of agricultural landscapes to stressors related to climate change and to enhance the adaptive capacity of ranchers. And it's been interesting for me to see how much energy has been aimed at the economic aspects of the puzzle and figuring out carbon markets, with the underlying assumption that if you can pay a rancher enough, he or she will make the transition from conventional ag to climate smart regenerative ag. And this is a topic I've been thinking about for over a decade now. I've interviewed a lot of farmers and ranchers in Australia and the US who've made the transition in order to understand what's involved. And what I've concluded in a nutshell, spoiler alert, main point of this talk, is that while financial support for the transition is often necessary, it's generally not sufficient, since the transition really involves some pretty big changes in thinking as well as doing. So, so what excites me about this topic is that agriculture is commonly and rightly portrayed as a major culprit in our climate crisis. It's a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Livestock systems occupy 1/4 of the Earth's surface. They're responsible for approximately 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions due to both methane emissions from enteric fermentation or cow burping, and to CO2 emissions from land use change and soil erosion and desertification. While all this is true, what's also becoming apparent, although in a controversial way, is that strategic planned grazing can actually be a key lever of positive change. And a lot of research lately has focused on how different approaches to grazing can enhance soil carbon sequestration and provide a natural climate solution. So the idea that ranchers can play a role in climate change mitigation is really exciting. It's kind of surprising and, of course, controversial, but it's exciting, I think, not without controversy. And just as a caveat, I'm a social scientist, so I'm not really qualified to comment on the strengths and weaknesses of the latest rangeland science on the links between management and soil carbon sequestration. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm assuming that ranchers can be a positive force on the landscape, and what interests me is how, when, and why they can be that positive force. So what is climate smart regenerative ag? Climate smart ag is a term coined by the FAO back in 2010. It's generally thought to have three prongs: enhancing adaptive capacity of the producer, mitigating climate change, and increasing food security. And typically, the thinking is that this can be done through policy interventions and financing mechanisms. Climate smart ag is also sometimes referred to as carbon farming, and it draws on many different sustainable ag practices, such as agroforestry, perennial agriculture, biochar, keyline, and holistic, most importantly for my talk, holistic management. So this is kind of an ugly table from one of my papers, but it's useful. It presents a summary of regenerative ranching principles, practices, and outcomes relevant to climate change mitigation. So the column on the left, the two main principles, obviously, are to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint, or the carbon footprint of livestock production, and enhance natural carbon sinks on the land. So for reducing the carbon footprint, the footprint can be reduced or eliminated by reducing the use of agrochemicals like synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, or using renewable energy sources like solar-powered water pumps or agrivoltaics, and also reducing the need for off-farm feed inputs or supplemental hay by increasing forage productivity and matching stocking rates to forage availability. And then ranchers can enhance natural carbon sinks through holistic planned grazing, which theoretically reduces bare ground and soil erosion and encourages the replacement of annual plants with deep-rooted perennials. And they also use soil amendments like compost and biochar. So this diagram illustrates the difference between deep-rooted perennials on land managed regeneratively or holistically, and the more shallow roots of annual species typical on conventional lands. And as you know, if you've ever talked to a regenerative rancher, they have a big focus on soil health, and they love showing you their big root wads like this one. And then this carbon farming workshop logo here that you see on the bottom and the left shows how farmers and ranchers and even pastoralists in Africa are starting to pride themselves and even gain an identity around offsetting greenhouse gas emissions from industry, so as the image with the smokestacks shows. These before and after photos taken on one of my case study ranches in northern New Mexico nicely illustrate how changing one's approach to range management can pretty drastically enhance vegetation cover and presumably carbon sequestration. In just 3 years, this rancher was able to replace bare ground with carbon-sucking, deep-rooted perennials, mainly through adoption of holistic planned grazing. So I was funded by the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station back in 2009. Big shout out to my colleague there, Dr. Susan Charnley, to look at what factors influence ranchers' contributions to climate change mitigation through climate smart regenerative agriculture. What are the common constraints, enablers, leverage points? And then what are the implications for practical interventions that facilitate transformation, not only transformation, but persistence? Because it's one thing to change practices, it's another to really stick with them over the long run. The persistence is definitely more of a tough nut to crack. So, and such practical interventions might include outreach and extension, or the development of voluntary carbon markets, or other financial incentives, for example. So some of the research was in the US West. And then I spent a sabbatical in Australia in 2013 and worked with colleagues at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, interviewing carbon farmers there. Big shout out to Dr. Nick Gill at University of Wollongong for making this research possible. And just as an aside, the USDA is still really investing a fair amount of money in research on this topic, probably in part because the department wants to play a lead role in implementation of a compliant carbon market if one should ever materialize. So it kind of wants to have a corner on the knowledge. So the results I'll present here draw on data from both Australia and the US West. And the US part took place between 2009 2013, a long time ago, which it was pretty, cutting edge back then. People weren't talking about ranchers and climate and carbon sequestration very much back then. But I interviewed 23 ranchers in Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Colorado who had generated carbon credits through the Chicago Climate Exchange, which some of you might remember. It was a voluntary carbon market that existed for a brief time and included a rangeland soil carbon sequestration protocol. So there are about 1,000 farmers across 1,000 farmers and ranchers across the U.S. that were able to participate in that program. It only lasted for like 3 or 4 years, but some of them made some decent money doing it. The program obviously had a lot of flaws, so it's not surprising that it ended up shutting down. Then also the Australia research, for sabbatical, I went off there in 2013, and that involved interviews with 23 grazers, down there, they don't call them ranchers, they call them farmers, or sheep and beef farmers, or grazers, and located in the wheat and sheep belt of the state of New South Wales. And these were all people who were known for their experience in climate smart regenerative ag. And I also interviewed holistic management educators in both Australia and the US. And these are the people who do many of the trainings on holistic planned grazing. Just I wanted to get their insights into how and why people learn about regenerative ag and why they adopt the practices. So, and then I also interviewed a bunch of key informants who could comment on what ranchers and farmers are up to, and such as USDA, NRCS, and the Australia Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. And then also some academics, consultants, nonprofits. And I also did some participant observation, which was really fun while I was in Australia, sitting in on an 8-week holistic management course taught at a local community college with a bunch of Aussie farmers who I got to know and got to visit their farms and stuff. So probably the most important finding from all this research is that while regenerative ranching might contribute to climate change mitigation, the opportunity to mitigate climate change is not generally a motivating factor for ranchers. We found that ranchers were motivated by a bunch of factors that were unrelated to climate change mitigation. So really, climate change mitigation should be seen as a co-benefit of regenerative ranching, not the main goal. In other words, even though society mostly values the climate change mitigation aspects of regenerative ranching, ranchers see other benefits that are more important to them. And so we wanted to document what factors motivated them and what challenges they encountered in transitioning, since that information would be important for the development of policies and programs incentivizing ranchers to transition. So we proposed that ranchers' decisions to adopt or not adopt regenerative ranching should be seen in the context of the social ecological system in which they operate. So this diagram portrays a rangeland social ecological system with social dynamics on the left here and ecological dynamics on the right. And the social dynamics include economic factors, personal factors, political factors, cultural factors. The ecological dynamics include water cycle, mineral cycle, energy flows, and community dynamics. And these social and ecological dynamics together act as constraints or enablers, influencing ranchers' ability to first understand the system, a lot of times through adaptive management, but then also to, by understanding the system, then they can know how to manage the system with regenerative ranching principles and practices. And then you can see the different suites of benefits along the top, with climate change mitigation in the middle, but also importantly, socioeconomic benefits in the upper left and other ecosystem benefits on the right. Socioeconomic benefits we commonly heard about had to do with increased productivity, reduced inputs and expenses, having nutrient-dense products, improved gut health, not only in the animals, but in the people who eat the meat that come from regeneratively grazed lands. Fewer veterinary expenses, financial well-being, a sense of community, a sense of right livelihood, and sometimes payments for ecosystem services. And then the ecosystem co-benefits aside included increased soil water holding capacity, increased resilience to droughts and floods, increased plant biodiversity, improved wildlife habitat, and the elimination of chemicals on the landscape. So, so in another article, we wrote about factors that contribute to rancher success with transitioning and especially persisting in regenerative ag. We drew on geographer Karen O'Brien's Spheres of Transformation framework, which suggests that transformation sustainability take place in personal, practical, and political spheres. So you've got your personal sphere, practical sphere, and political sphere. And then for each sphere, we looked at what we called zones of friction and traction. So traction meaning what encourages or moves ranchers towards transformation, and then friction meaning what gets in the way, you know, in each of these spheres that moves them away from transformation. And this table from the paper summarizes those zones of friction and traction in each of the three spheres. And the friction and traction concepts can also be thought of as constraints and enablers, just using different language, different journal article. But because we're short on time, I'll just highlight a few. In the personal sphere, there's friction associated with fear of change, trusting natural processes, rethinking one's relationship with nature. In the practical sphere, there's traction associated with greater resilience to drought, reduced inputs and expenses, a sense of community. And in the political sphere, just for an example, there's friction associated with pressure from chemical salesmen to continue purchasing those herbicides, pesticides, and synthetic fertilizers. So the table is fairly comprehensive based on all our interviews, but I've just listed here what I see as the biggest sets of hurdles, the biggest sources of friction, which keep this approach to climate change mitigation from being straightforward or simple. I think it's really important to recognize that ranchers' ability to effectively contribute to climate change mitigation and realize the dreams of people like Alan Savory or Paul Hawken or Joel Salatin and other proponents of regenerative grazing, it really hinges on their approach to managing land and animals, and more specifically, their ability to think differently than conventional ranchers. So we suggest that enhancing natural carbon sinks on rangelands requires a nuanced understanding of fundamental ecosystem processes and a systems thinking approach to management, which includes understanding the relationship between soil carbon and herbivory, the stimulus and response in land and animals, understanding herbivore behavior and how it can be manipulated, and seeing cattle as a means to an end rather than the end in itself. And so this different approach to thinking results in the need for new skills, which include a different approach to ecological monitoring, monitoring and interpreting animal behavior, low stress livestock handling, living without chemicals and tolerating weeds, and many more. There's lots of new skills and tools that you have to learn if you're going to go down this road. So in my remaining time, I'm just going to share some quotes with you to give you a sense of how complicated it is to enhance soil carbon sequestration with animals. And then I'll end with some findings regarding traction, what I see as promising ways to promote more of this. So here's a nice quote from an Aussie farmer about the need for what we academic nerds call systems thinking. They don't use that term systems thinking, but basically that's what he's talking about here. He says, everyone talks about carbon, but to increase carbon, you've got to fix the other problems first. And I wish I could do this in an Aussie accent, but you have to just imagine that one. You got to fix soil structure and all the other things, but preceding that, you've got to go back to plants. Plants are what drives pretty well everything, like soil health, soil structure. It's all microbial health. And the carbon, I think it comes well after that, the increase in carbon. And then I love these quotes about the need to understand animal behavior in order to be an effective carbon farmer. One guy says, it's getting inside of the mind of the animal and he's comfortable with you. You manage them more often. So certainly I think the animals change. They become really easy to move. And yeah, you change. You gain knowledge and you start learning what works and what doesn't work. Many of my interviewees were big fans of Dr. Fred Provenza, a Utah State University animal scientist here in the, who's devoted much of his career to understanding the relationship between soil carbon and herbivory and why livestock eat what they eat and how they can be persuaded to eat a wider variety of plants, often through low stress livestock handling. And this is key if you're trying to cut down on herbicides and find natural ways to deal with weeds. As this farmer notes in the second quote here, the goal of the weed eating approach is to completely remove the anxiety that the animals are feeling when they're interacting with people. When they're in a non-anxious state, they're more likely and able to experiment and they try different foods. For the soil implications, I would make the point that animals that have a wider behavioral set of eating habits will recycle more of the wider range of nutrients that they've been consuming, and that has long-term implications for the soil biota. That's from an Aussie farmer. So sources of traction, but surmounting all of the psychological and managerial challenges in becoming a regenerative farmer, it's a hard, steep climb. I heard once over and over again about it was like a big deal to make the transformation, but it has these huge payoffs for many of them. Another key finding from our research was that the rewards associated with working more closely with nature and engaging in regular monitoring and constantly learning act as positive feedbacks that sustain their commitment to regenerative agriculture. So some of my favorite quotes had to do with the emotional aspects of engaging in regenerative ag. This guy says, I love walking out here, feeling the soft soil under my feet. I could walk out here all day. It makes me happy. Our old place in the Riverina, all the bare soil, it made me depressed. I can feel the ground has gotten softer over time, just driving over it. And I love smelling soil. Yeah, it smells earthy, you know, it's nice. I mean, Dad used to make all this compost at home. It was beautiful. You get that smell, it's magnificent. So my most recent article on this topic for a special issue of Sustainability Science on the how of transformation was calling for integrated approaches to understanding transformation, did a deeper dive into those personal sphere dynamics. So I focused on findings related, for this article, I focused on findings related specifically to the joys of giving up agrochemicals and learning how to grow food chemical-free by connecting with the microbiome. And we found that negative experiences with agrochemicals associated with increasing costs and declining results were a really important driver of change. And conversely, positive experience learning about the microbiome and practicing ecological approaches to fertilization and pest control engendered enthusiasm and commitment to a transition away from high input agriculture and a transformation in mindset. And further, the conviviality associated with communities of practice, like these microscope groups in Australia that I encountered, those groups played a really important role in the transition process as farmers solidified their new identities and they participated in ongoing social learning. And so based on these results, I argued that that farmers have this whole sort of love of nature that can be cultivated and enhanced through encounters with the microscope and the microbiome. I think this quote really sums up our findings that whole philosophy of trying to kill things that want to grow and trying to grow things that want to die, it's incredibly soul destroying and costly. Again, an Aussie farmer saying that. So and then here you see insights from a consultant who works with farmers and ranchers to help them get off chemicals and transition to biological approaches to farming. This is actually an American consultant who works with US farmers. She says, you know, it has to do not just with understanding the microbiome, but with feelings of kinship with nature and animals and plants and microbes resulting from learning about and working with the soil. She says, one of the biggest aha moments is when they start to see the soil structure change on their property. For example, they'll see that before they could not stick their finger into the soil deeper than half an inch, and now they can go in all the way to their palm. They start seeing that mycelium forming and the soil aggregation happening and the moisture in the soil from the water seeping in and not running off, and they're like, wow, it's possible, it's amazing. They look at the improved soil with disbelief, and then they get happy, they get excited. And then the fact that another person, an educator in the US who works with farmers here, the fact that soil is a living thing, that it's alive, I think is the thing that makes it interesting, because then you can identify with it in a way that seemed very external before. The same functions that happen in the soil are happening in you, and that is why you're alive. This guy happens to be like an amazing teacher, and he really inspires people when he talks to them about soil. He gets really excited. So I see this excitement and enthusiasm about working with soil as an underappreciated driver of behavioral change and potentially a powerful leverage point for larger scale social ecological transformation. How do we tap into people's sense of wonder and excitement and enthusiasm about things that are sustainable? You know, that's really the holy grail, I think. So this diagram from the Global Environmental Change article was an attempt to capture that insight and portray how feedbacks associated with daily monitoring occur in both cognitive and emotional spheres and drive adaptive or proactive management. So as you can see, the loop on the right is your basic adaptive management cycle: plan, implement, monitor, evaluate, learn, adjust, associated with cognitive processes. You've all seen that about adaptive management. But what I'm suggesting is that the learning is enhanced with what's going on simultaneously in the emotional realm. So I tried to portray that in this other loop over here: sensations, emotions, feelings, virtues, drives. Those kind of combine with the cognitive processes to really create these pretty powerful positive feedbacks, or self-amplifying positive feedbacks. So this diagram portrays how those feedback loops and learning play out over time and are like I say, self-amplifying. It's an attempt at a conceptual model of transformation associated with the adoption of regenerative agriculture, where self-amplifying feedback loops fueled by traction in the personal, practical, and political spheres increase regenerative potential over time, leading to persistence and alignment with farmers' holistic goals. And then obviously friction, there's the arrow going down too. Friction in these spheres can impede that growth process. So traction is kind of contributing to this upward cycle, and the friction can hold things back. And friction can occur in the personal, practical, and political spheres, as I mentioned. So to summarize and conclude, I'll just say that first, that climate smart regenerative ag should be thought of as more than a set of practices. It requires systems thinking and new skills to manage animals as tools. And second, self-amplifying feedback loops by embodied experience, fueled by embodied experiences, can enhance regenerative potential over time. So what are the implications of this research for management and governance? I think that could be the focus of a whole separate presentation. What kinds of outreach and education are needed, which agencies should be doing it, which federal agencies or which NGOs are going to be most effective in connecting and educating, and what kind of programs are going to be most useful: field trips, demonstration days, things like that. Like, there's just a lot of different tools and strategies for engaging farmers and ranchers and kind of inducing these epiphanies that are kind of exciting to think about. And there's a lot of experimentation going on right now all over the country and all over the world, really. But so I think there's a real need for, and that mainly the one key point is that there's all this excitement about carbon markets. I'm always a little bit skeptical because sure, the money is going to be helpful, but it's not going to be sufficient. It's not like if you just give them enough money, people will just be like, all right, I'll completely change the way I think and learn all these new skills and do things completely differently, have a completely different relationship with my animals. It really has to come from within, a deeper drive. And often that really is related to some sort of crisis, or some aha moment, which it's kind of unpredictable when those happen. But there's a real need for an integrated holistic approach to engaging ranchers in transformational, experiential, social learning is what I would say. And down the road, I feel like there's more research, need for more research on the potential for regenerative ag to become the new normal. Like, how do you scale this up? And a lot of that's going to have to do with dealing with friction and traction in the political sphere. Because if you think about, who's not excited about this, big ag is not excited about this because this involves generally not using as many chemicals. And all my interviewees basically foregoed, did not use any chemicals at all. And so you can imagine that the people, groups like Monsanto, Cargill, and so on, are going to be a little nervous about any kind of large scale transition to farming and ranching that doesn't require all those inputs. So there's a lot of politics and that are involved here that would be interesting to dig into more. But anyway, I think I'll end there and just see if there are questions, and thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Hannah. There are a lot of people on the call, so this was so great that you were able to give such a rich presentation in a relatively short amount of time. So we've got full 30 minutes for questions and answers, and we are thrilled to take those. If you want to take yourself off mute and ask a question, you can do that. You can raise your hand in the participant column, and you can also just put your question in the chat. And Hannah, if you stop sharing your screen, then we'll get like the gallery view of everyone. There we go. Brett, you're off mute. Did that mean you wanted to ask a question? Maybe not. So who would like to start?
Hey, this is Tony. That was a great presentation. Thanks. I wondered if you could comment a little bit, reflecting on your interviews. I love the whole soil to soul connection, right? So Siri, when I'm texting in my phone, always autocorrects soil to soul. So I think you've really captured something there. But I'm really curious, right? What if the most important part of trying to change how you manage rangelands for carbon-based outcomes ends up being unsmellable, even if it's good for your soul, or invisible, right? Even if you look at the structure and you're like, wow, that's good stuff, or look how far I jam my hand into this much richer with organic matter soil because of my management practices. So can you just comment, like, did you get a little bit of that tension? I mean, if these things are invisible and unsmellable, how do we make sure that they're very enriching for the soul?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's why I really kind of became obsessed with these microscope groups. I thought they were so interesting, and the power of the microscope. Um, there's a woman named Elaine Ingham who has done talks all over the world. She was a professor at Oregon State University for many years, and then she kind of got politely asked to leave, was not offered tenure because her research was pretty here in our department, our College of Ag, because her research was pretty controversial and kind of did not reflect well on like big industrial GMO type ag. Anyway, she went on to become a really well-known consultant. She, like I said, she consults all over the world and gives talks, and she's really engaging. And she always shows images of from what's happening with the microbiome and the micro herds galloping across the screen. And she tells stories about what's happening with the nematodes and the mycelium and what they're doing. And she just really enraptures the audience. And so you need someone who can do that kind of interpretation. And so there's the piece about just the tool of the microscope that is so interesting, just that sort of that that visibility that the microscope can provide. But then also you need a really charismatic person who can explain it. And then so people in Australia would go to these microscope groups regularly, and they'd drink wine and they'd bring their soil samples, and they would look at each other's samples under the microscope and kind of compare notes and do a little bit of learning while a little bit of socializing. And then they'd go home feeling a little inspired and want to like do better and experiment with different compost teas to put on their land, come back, maybe have more creatures under their lens next time. So yeah, it is tricky because without that visibility, maybe people just look at it as like, oh, it's just dirt. It's not very exciting. So I think it speaks to the need for a new approach to education. And even like in the early years, K through 12, we need to get more kids out there with microscopes and looking at the soil and more excited about what's happening under there. There's a professor here at Oregon State, James Cassidy, who's famous for his classes because he just gets students so fired up, and he takes them out in the forest on a field trip with just a little hand lens and has them looking at just the creatures in the duff. And a lot of them end up becoming soil science majors. I think people are just looking for that kind of inspiration and awe and wonder. But like you say, it's not immediately visible in the everyday world, but we need more people who can do that interpretation for us.
Well, I think you'll enjoy meeting Tony, Hannah, because I think we've got one of those right here. The next question comes from Ian Foley, and he asks, what kind of producer incentives do they have in Australia, and are they successful?
Well, the reason I went to Australia was at the time was back in 2012, and I had some extra money left over from my funding to study farmers and ranchers in the U.S. And I was like, what? Well, where else in the world are ranchers, livestock producers, being engaged in climate smart ag? And it was the only two places were Australia and New Zealand. So I decided to go there for my sabbatical to go investigate. And I went to Australia and started out with questions like, hey, how's that carbon farming initiative working out? Is that really inspiring you guys all to change? And they were all like, no. The carbon farming initiative was one of the early compliant carbon markets that was being pitched by the Australian government. Is one of the, I think it was like the only one actually in the world at the time that would include ranchers, that would include soil rangeland soil carbon sequestration. But it really was not a motivating factor, and that's where I ended up stopping even asking about it, because it was a non-starter. People didn't want to talk about the carbon farming initiative. They're like, oh yeah, well maybe I don't know, maybe I'll get paid a few dollars for that, but that's not why I'm doing this, and here's why I'm doing this. And then we go into like, you know, an hour or two of conversation about all the other reasons that they were doing it. I don't know what the latest is on the carbon farming initiative there, and I think it has continued to advance and get more sophisticated, and maybe there are people that are excited about it now. So I can't really comment. I haven't been back there in a while, so I can't really say. You know, there are some voluntary carbon markets here in the U.S. that are involving ranchers. Some of them are kind of more boutique-y, you know, where you can buy a carbon offset and you know that it's going to like go to your local rancher and you feel good about that. And, but nothing huge has really gotten off the ground here, as you know, in the US. I would say there are no good examples worldwide right now of ranchers, livestock producers getting paid a lot of money for carbon. I think there's a lot of effort and excitement around it, but it's still in the really early stages.
Other questions from the audience?
I have one. This is Sarah. Hannah, I was wondering, I'm thinking about the kind of emotions stuff in that diagram you showed with the adaptive management and then the learning and emotions. It just occurred to me, I just kind of wondered if we can match that kind of emotion and adaptive management philosophy with the systems thinking. I wonder if there's a connection there, and if you could speak to that at all, like what the connections might be. It just occurred to me like an epiphany that how could we teach both of those things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, systems thinking kind of has that very kind of dry, boring feel to it, you know, from engineering. But if you think of systems thinking being about taking into consideration the whole social ecological system, then it's hard to ignore some of those more nuanced aspects of the social part of the social ecological system, which have to do with the personal sphere. And again, a lot of the most important insights into that come from Karen O'Brien, who's a professor of geography at University of Oslo. And she's pitched the idea of these 3 spheres of transformation that are all important: political, practical, and personal. But she argues that the personal sphere is the most important to understand, to be able to understand and facilitate transformation. And so that's been really exciting for me. So I think that, so when I teach I have a grad seminar called Social Ecological Systems, and I definitely have the students read about some of these case studies that involve ranchers and farmers, kind of the affects around both the good and the bad, you know, the feelings of dismay and horror when you see a burnt out landscape, or realize that you don't have any water to grow your crops, you know, and crisis, but also the joy that comes from seeing the fruits of your labor and seeing less bare ground and softer ground. So I think that, yeah, it's maybe a paradigm shift in how we teach about systems thinking to be more inclusive into the personal sphere as well as the practical.
Cool, thank you.
Caroline, did you want to ask a question? Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a student here at MSU, and I'm wondering what policy changes need to happen at a federal level to support more regenerative agriculture in the United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that's not really my area of expertise, thinking about all the farm bill programs that need to come into play. Certainly like a carbon market would be useful. And I think the USDA is experimenting, you know, working on that, learning and gathering data on that. There's a lot of stuff in the Title I of the Farm Bill that probably needs to be addressed, as well as the conservation title. The conservation incentive programs probably need to be more practice-based as opposed to requiring them to be outcome-based, because we still don't have a really great handle on how to measure soil carbon. And so sometimes the inability to measure soil carbon gets in the way of figuring out how to pay ranchers or farmers for soil carbon sequestration. So I think maybe at this point we still need to be a little bit more lenient about the evidence of the outcomes and just try to incentivize the practices and have practice-based incentive programs. I think, dealing with insurance, the fact that a lot of farmers are covered by insurance so that they can do irresponsible things and have failed crops and they'll still get paid. It's sort of perverse incentives to keep doing the wrong thing. So changing some of those incentive programs and those insurance programs so that there's a tighter feedback between what you're doing on the land and what you get to experience financially, right? So, but again, I'm not the best person on the nuts and bolts of the policy. That's definitely.
Cliff Montaigne.
Hannah, this was a super presentation. Thanks very much. Did you find examples of ranchers and farmers monitoring cooperatively using the same methods and then sharing those methods, or were they all mostly doing it themselves in their own environment without sharing?
Oh, definitely lots of communities of practice for sure. Like that holistic management class that I sat in on in Australia, I think they're still getting together. That was back in 2013, and I still am on the email list and see it. They're still getting together and visiting each other's farms. Yeah, there's a lot of conviviality associated with that community. And in part, they're often seen as pariahs. They're people who switch to holistic planned grazing when all their neighbors are conventional are often thought of as weirdos and can even be sort of shunned. And so they kind of have a need to stick together and they'll find communities of practice that maybe aren't necessarily their local people, because sometimes in some cases I even have quotes about, after I switched at the supermarket, so-and-so wouldn't even look at me anymore. There's a funny thing about like resentment when people in farmer communities where people don't like it when people step outside and do things differently, especially if they're successful in doing those things. So if someone's got bare ground and the neighbor has really good grass on the, right across the fence line, it's sort of threatening in some ways. And so I've definitely found that there's really strong communities of practice with the holistic management community, and they're kind of international networks. A lot of them know each other across national boundaries and connect and have conferences, and some of them are associated with the Savory Institute hubs, Holistic Management International. But yeah, more and more there's a lot of NGOs that serve as gathering spots, because again, it's still weird enough that people feel the need for camaraderie in order to continue on their path.
Final question, did you find more producers interested in this process who were at the edge of their ropes financially or having really difficult times, or were there more producers who were already doing well and not in a panic?
Yeah, almost to a person, every person I'm trying to remember about the US ranchers. I don't know if I asked that question specifically, but in Australia, when I asked about what precipitated the change, it almost always was some sort of crisis. So it was either bankruptcy or drought or some kind of accident or illness or a divorce. And I think, yeah, similarly too in the US, it's because change is not easy. So often it would be like, well, I didn't have any other options, and somebody invited me to a holistic management talk, so I went, and then all of a sudden these little bells started going off, and I started thinking, oh, that's why I'm having these problems. And that would be like a typical story. It's kind of amazing to hear that same story over and over again from all my interviewees in Australia. So that's kind of a problem there, is that you hate to think that there has to be a crisis before people will actually change. So that's why we need better models for engaging people. And that's why people often move to the financial incentive. Well, if we just pay them enough, then they'll want to switch. But change is hard, and a lot of times it happens with the passing of the property onto the next generation. They have to wait. Like did a case study of the Trig Ranch in New Mexico, which I published, and for them, there was these 3 daughters, and they really wanted to change the way things were going on their ranch, but they couldn't do it until their father died, because he did not like any of these newfangled weird practices. But once he died, they hired a consultant and they got the whole thing transitioned. And the transition takes a while, typically maybe 3-4 years, just to really get the system completely transitioned. And then on from there, it's a big, long, steep learning curve for definitely.
So question in the chat, Hannah from Coulter, who wants to know what the difference is between the term sustainability and regenerative, or sustainable and regenerative. If these concepts are basically synonymous, he asks, is this rebranding effectively creating traction?
Yeah, regenerative definitely is the new buzzword for sure. I mean, it was resilient last year, I think. Now it's regenerative. But yeah, sustainability is definitely kind of losing its cachet for sure, I think, in these worlds. And my favorite explanation for that comes from this really funny Australian named Darren Doherty. And he talks about this. He says, like sustainable, like think of your marriage. Would you really want just a sustainable marriage? Like that doesn't sound very good. What you want is a regenerative marriage that's like constantly getting better and moving and changing and growing, and sustainable almost has this stagnant feeling. I have a grant right now from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association to look at the social sustainability of the U.S. beef industry. That's their words. National Cattlemen's Beef Association is interested in bottom line, social, economic, ecological sustainability. So we've had to use that term. And so I had my student do a whole big literature review on social sustainability. What are people even saying about that? And there's not a lot on social sustainability as it relates to agriculture, certainly not a lot as it relates to ranching, but there's a lot of people talking about regenerative and resilient and restorative and things like that. Because there wasn't a lot with the literature review, I supplemented the literature review with a bunch of interviews with opinion leaders in the US that have thought a lot about what we can call social sustainability in the beef industry. And many of them they just did not like that term sustainability. And they're like, why would we want to sustain something that's really not working? We need a fundamental change in the way we're producing food and fiber in this country. And sustaining it is sustaining anything about it is really not a productive direction. They almost, to a person, preferred terms like regenerative and resilient. So it sounds like a good paper topic to write about that for a class. About do a deep dive into whatever happened to sustainability, and are people still using it, and in what case is it useful and where is it not. But when it comes to ranching, I think regenerative is certainly a more exciting, more descriptive for what I was seeing. It's just all about like creating these dynamic systems that you don't know exactly what direction they're going in, but you're just trying to like steer them to, you're trying to promote ecosystem functionality and kind of let nature do its thing, and you don't really, it's a little bit unpredictable. So it's dynamic. It's not something that you can control and sustain and compartmentalize at all.
So here's another question in the chat from David Laufenberg, who says, great presentation, thanks for your work. Are you familiar with any examples of municipalities or local governments who are paying ranchers or farmers because they manage lands upstream of town? So essentially, is there any local government or community scale incentive that ties water quality outcomes to farm and ranching practices?
So water quality outcomes. So you're talking more about payment for watershed services as opposed to carbon sequestration. Is that right?
Climate, whatever.
So like under the category of payments for ecosystem services, there would be payments for carbon sequestration. There's payments for water quality. But I had a PhD student, Drew Bennett, who's now at University of Wyoming, who did his whole dissertation about payment for watershed services. And there are a number of examples of cities like Denver, Colorado, who are paying people in the upstream area to not cut down trees and to do restoration in burned out forests because it affects their water quality, their water supply. And I think there's another good example in New Mexico. But if you are interested in that, there's a whole dissertation that even has a table, the typology of all the different types of payment for watershed services programs that he found across the country that is pretty interesting.
I just put Drew's name in the chat there. Other questions? I'll ask a question. So I'm curious about this is elaborating a little bit on what you're discussing both with Cliff and Tony. But one of the things I see as sort of an observer in this space is like the urge to quantify and focus on, are we really creating additive benefits? And so that all comes out of this logic of like, how do we get the right payment to people for what they're doing with soil health management in particular? And I'm wondering if, like, stepping back from what you've looked at, if you see that as something that has been constructive in this space of adoption, or if it's, a distraction. And I would say, Cliff, like talking to you, that part of, I see also in that attention in like, what is monitoring? Is monitoring outward facing to defend and provide examples of good ranching practices to agencies? I see a lot of interest in that on the part of private landowners, versus monitoring just for learning and discovery, which is kind of what I hear more with the microscope clubs. So any comments on that, Hannah, of like, what you see in it as generative or potentially, negative in those relationships?
You mean in pushing the carbon market approach?
Well, just the urge to like really focus on quantifying. Are you, can you measure this? Is it really, and like, because I think a lot of the science remains somewhat inconclusive, right? And so that, at least that's the affective sense I hear about it.
Yeah. Yeah, the danger with hanging your hat so much on being able to quantify soil carbon is that you run the risk of just throwing out the whole thing because you can't measure it. And I just always, I mean, if I'm completely honest, when I'm in talks that are going into the minutia of how you measure carbon, I'm a social scientist, but my eyes kind of glaze over because I'm thinking like, even if we can't measure the carbon, we know that these practices are improving the landscape in all these other ways. Even if we can't prove there's soil carbon sequestration, we know there's less bare ground, we know the animals are happier, we know that there's less chemicals, we know the people are happier, we know that the soil has better water holding capacity, people are more resilient to drought. There's just all these other benefits that, like I said, that's why I really like the idea of thinking of climate change mitigation, carbon sequestration as a co-benefit. I don't think there's any problem with trying to focus a lot of science on measuring, because that is, what's that saying? What you manage for what you can measure, or something like that. What you can measure, I don't know what you manage for, but yeah, I don't see them as it. I think they're just two kind of parallel tracks, is understanding the larger benefits of regenerative ag versus the very narrow focus on carbon. And there's a certain segment of government and society that needs to have that quantification. So that's just an ongoing project.
We have time for maybe one more question before people get on to their 1 o'clock activity. Tony has his hand up.
Hey, super quick, unless there's somebody else queued up, Julia. So Hannah, I'm just gonna pose you something. It's, I love the co-benefit frame. I happen to agree with it, but I think our focus is completely wrong with focusing on regenerative ag for improved carbon sinks. And, I do think of that as one side of the coin, and I think that focus is going to get us in a little bit of a trouble. I wonder what your thoughts would be on looking at the other side of the coin is, well, if we have some attention to the soil, emotional investment in the soil, maybe we could just reduce topsoil erosion. Like, talk about not sexy, right? But the big deal is if you could just minimize your topsoil erosion, talk about all kinds of good benefits, right? So I just wanted to pose that, see what you thought.
Yeah, I agree. I'm right with you there, because I like yeah, that just seems to be the much more dire and pressing need, is to reduce soil erosion. I'm right with you there. And yeah, like I said, the other stuff can just be gravy. You know, and one person even said that, one of the ranchers was like, you know, I'm already doing this stuff anyway for all these other reasons. It makes sense for me. It makes me happy. My animals are better. I'm making more money. I'm spending less, and you know, the carbon payments are just like gravy. But that's a harder message to get across, I think.
Well, with that, I think, Cliff, your hand is still up. Is that an accident?
It's an accident, sorry.
Well, no, it happens. So anyways, I just thank everyone for your great attendance. It's so nice to see so many faces, and I can tell this is a super important topic. If you are dying to talk more with Dr. Gosnell, let me know and we'll see if we can squeeze some time in when she's visiting. I'm happy to help coordinate that. And thank you so much, Hannah, for being here for a fantastic presentation. Very grateful to you. Yeah, and if you want to unmute yourself and give Dr. Gosnell a round of applause, we'll let you all go.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's great to connect with you all. You all have a lot going on there in Montana. So there's lots of exciting potential there. See you soon.
We'll see you soon.